Welcome to Inside the Vault. My name is Sandy Trenholm, and I'm the collection director for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And tonight we're going to be talking about materials pertaining to Benjamin Franklin. And this program is funded by the endowment of the Diplomatic Reception Rooms. We're really excited to be sharing some of their materials with you tonight, as well as some of our own. With that, I want to introduce tonight's speakers. First, we have Zara Charles, who is an 18-year experience with being a teacher in the classroom. She's taught AP Art History, AP European History, AP United States History, AP World History. So an all-around, well-rounded AP history. You've got to tackle the sciences next, Zara. And she's also my colleague at the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. She's one of our education program managers. So if you're an educator out there, you might have had some conversations with Sarah already. And she's also an instructor of art history at the Sotheby's Institute for Art for Secondary Students. Sorry. So Sarah, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks so much for having me, everyone. I'm super excited to be here and talk about my first love, which is art history, and really bring something that I did in all my history classes, as well as my art history class, to all of you. And one of my favorite artists who I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So thanks so much.
All right, thank you. And our guest historian for tonight is Liz Covart. She is the founding director of the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. And she's best known for her award-winning podcast, Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history. If you haven't checked it out yet, you absolutely have to. It's really a cool podcast about colonial America, which I guess you can tell that we might be fans of American history here. And so, Liz, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a big fan of teachers. My brother teaches high school, and thank you so much for all the work that you do to educate your students. It's really hard work, and I'm really grateful to be here tonight to help you out, and thank you for what you do. I am a scholar of the Revolution. That's my area of expertise. And over the years, because I named my podcast Ben Franklin's World to talk about the world that created him and the world that he helped create, I've become, very knowledgeable about Ben Franklin. And he's become, one of these fun topics that I've learned more about, and I can't wait to talk about him tonight.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for helping make history accessible to teachers and students. And with that, I want to introduce tonight's documents. We're really excited. We will be discussing two main pieces and a few other art pieces as well. But our main pieces are the official members' copy of the U.S. Constitution printed on September 17th, 1787, and it was distributed to the delegates to take home with them and for them to distribute to people where they lived to promote the Constitution. Out of 500 copies that were printed, only 13 survive today. And so this is one of those, and it happens to be inscribed to Jonathan Williams from Ben Franklin. It's a surprise who that is. We're going to tell you all about that in just a second. And our second piece is the Houdon bust of Benjamin Franklin from 1778. And this is a piece that the Diplomatic Reception Rooms is featuring here tonight with us. We're really excited to be talking about that as well. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Sarah.
So we're talking tonight about art and why we look at art to give us a narrative of history. And I want you to just imagine the first language of humans. I know a lot of my English teachers are going to disagree with me, but really, the most important and universal language, and of course I'm saying this as an art history buff, is art. And so if we look at this beautiful image of Ben Franklin being crowned with laurel wreaths in France, we know that a message is being created and crafted, not only about Franklin, but about America and what it can mean to people. So why don't we move to the next slide? So I always like to start out by thinking about the broader context of history. And if there are any art history teachers out there who have met me or any AP Euro teachers, we all know that the Enlightenment is such a foundational part of our curriculum. And of course, it's incredibly important for understanding the era of neoclassical art and architecture. So when we think about the Enlightenment, this is a time when so many new ideas are being shared and discovered. Newton with gravity, John Locke with his natural rights of life, liberty, property. Voltaire is rejecting the Catholic Church and the state through theater and satire like Candide. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau is talking about nature and feelings and trying to leave behind the corruption of civilization. And to be clear, when we talk about civilization, we mean specifically the Rococo era, the era of the French monarchy. And so people start to think, how do we create a new order visually? Let's move to the next slide. So neoclassical art is going to harken back to classical times, particularly the iconography of Greece and Rome. You can see here one of my favorite photos of a veristic head of a Roman patrician. And here the idea was that the detail, the verism, the truth, the vérité en français, is revealing the wisdom of this patrician to the Roman public. And when artists during the neoclassical time are looking back at art, they're highly inspired by what has gone on in the immediate context. So let's not forget that in 1709, Pompeii and Herculaneum were being excavated, and this created such excitement across Europe and the West to uncover the amazing imagery that hadn't been seen for so long. As a result, we get Johann Winkelmann writing the first text of classical art history. And then Edward Gibbon writing The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And of course, politically, we have Atlantic revolutions in America, France, Haiti, Mexico, and South America. And so this era of rethinking and trying to capture the past is in everyone's visual imagination. Let's go to the next slide. So then we get Ben Franklin. And I love to teach about Ben Franklin in all my history classes, in addition to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, particularly through the lens of art, because all students recognize him. And so it's really interesting to think about how artists depicted Franklin. And it's also really interesting to think about the fact that Franklin was really the OG influencer. He was very aware of curating a persona and reaching out to artists and having them interact with him, depict him, bringing them to America, all to create this new visual order of neoclassical art. So our first image here is showing us the rage for Franklin's likeness. He was depicted over and over and over again. I can't emphasize enough how much of a celebrity he was. And Franklin was a little bit of a fashionista in terms of how he played the persona of an American. He was aware of constructing a sartorial presence. He often dressed simply. He didn't wear a wig. He would wear beaver fur, sable fur. And this really captured the imagination of the French aristocracy, which we're going to see is of supreme economic and political importance to America. Let's go to the first image. So here we have this beautiful pastel by the amazing genre painter Jean-Baptiste Greuze. And Greuze was, of his own accord, a very famous painter in France. And he was hired by a scientist, Élie de Beaumont, who was a friend of Franklin's and a member of the Loge des Neuf Sœurs, which is basically the Masonic Lodge over in France. And so Greuze was a very prominent painter in the Salon, which is where the celebrated artists in France would display their new pieces. And he was particularly known for depicting moralizing scenes of sensibilité and naturalism. And so here we see this introduction to Franklin as a philosopher, as a statesman, very importantly, as a man who wears a simple, again, this is simple for the time in France, linen jabot, a white waistcoat, and a sable-trimmed banyan. And all of this is meant to be a source of fascination to the French audience, who would not have seen a statesman dressing in this way. Let's move to the next slide. So that brings us to the great master, Jean-Antoine Houdon, who was by far the most celebrated sculptor of the neoclassical era. And I like to think that Franklin and Houdon were like two ships passing in the night for a little bit at French society. They met formally in 1783, but what's interesting is that Franklin definitely left a mark on Houdon because he created works of art about Franklin that he was recalling from memory. So we can definitely make the argument that Franklin left a lasting impression. So Houdon was famous for depicting other scholars like Rousseau and Voltaire. And so when he exhibited this bust of Franklin at the Salon, in a way, he was making a statement. Franklin belongs in the ranks of the great French philosophers of the Enlightenment. And I'm going to depict him in the way I would depict these men, and thus the way that Greco-Roman classical sculptures were also depicted. Next slide, please. And so when you look closely at Houdon's Terracotta, you can see the verism. Again, we're looking at those cues of wisdom, the wrinkles, the crow's feet, the lines around the mouth, the attention to the eyes, the hair that just perfectly lays on his shoulders. And we get the sense that Franklin is a thinker. And so ultimately, we know that Houdon created this piece in terracotta and he exhibited at the Salon so that he could attract orders for more expensive busts in a similar style in more expensive material. What he didn't realize is that he would establish a kinship with Franklin. The two would then depart for the United States. They would sail across the ocean together to Philadelphia. Houdon and his assistants then went to Mount Vernon and went on to sculpt Jefferson, Fulton, and of course, the preeminent statue that exists in Virginia of our first president, George Washington. Let's move to the next slide. So Franklin was so incredibly popular that many other artists capitalized on his image and began to create items like medallions that anyone And by anyone, I mean someone of the middle class or the aristocracy could purchase. Again, to kind of show their affinity with the Enlightenment, to show that they had interest in the American Revolution. And so we have this amazing medallion by Jean-Baptiste Nini that was inscribed with the words, "He snatched the lightning from the skies and the scepter from the tyrants." And this was an expression that was coined by the statesman and economist Turgot. And Franklin very much admired this thinker. And so think about what we imagine now and what we know about Franklin. Even my daughter is reading Magic Treehouse, and she was talking to me about Ben Franklin. She's like, oh, electricity. And so these portraits were incredibly popular. Let's move to the next slide. Franklin himself was very much aware of the attention he was getting. And remember, he's in his 70s. So he is, in a way, I like to imagine, enjoying it. And so I found this letter that he wrote to his daughter about the Nini medallions. And if you're watching this recording and you want to take a look at this document in greater detail, I definitely would refer you to the whole correspondence. But I think that the final line is particularly interesting. From the number of dolls now made of him, he may be truly said that in that sense to be idolized in this country. And so we have this amazing just text, image, art, conversation that's constructing an image of Franklin. Let's move to our final piece. So our final piece here that we have from the State Department is really showing us how Franklin remained an enduring subject of fascination. So this is a painting that was done later on, from what we think, by the artist Boilly. And Boilly was known for his trompe-l'oeil, which is basically a type of art that fools the eye, that makes you think you're looking at something in 3D, when of course you're looking at a 2D oil painting. So here the artist is imagining Houdon. He's constructing the past in the past. And he's welcoming French audiences as if we could just walk into Houdon's studio ourselves to the creation of neoclassical art. And you can see here the amazing fashion of the French aristocracy juxtaposed with the somber pose and attire of Franklin. And think back to those earlier images. Next slide. So here we see Franklin remembered alongside classical imagery, bas-relief sculptures, Houdon's famed depictions of Le Crochet, of Voltaire. And we can see that the artist uses a trope, actually, I would argue from Caravaggio, of bringing the light from the window and using the outstretched arm of Le Crochet to create emphasis on Franklin. Next slide. And so if we look in detail, we can again see Franklin placed into the halls of the great classical past. The artist includes an allusion to the Belvedere torso. He includes classical putti. Of course, there's Le Crochet and Voltaire. And thus we forever remember this moment in history and art as a time when America was founded. And Ben Franklin was incredibly instrumental in constructing a narrative during this founding era through art.
All right. Well, thank you, Zara. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
We will have some questions for you at the end, I promise. And we are going to turn now to Liz, who's going to tell us about Franklin, his family, and the Constitution.
One of the things I love about being a historian is that we get to play detective all the time. And the information that we collect and build from documents or like the artwork that Sarah was just talking about, is that information collectively can tell us who we are and how we came to be who we are. So one of the things when I was presented with this copy of the Constitution, which before my friends at Gilder Lehrman had shown me, I didn't know existed. So what I would look at it as a historian in this document is, why is it being printed? I'd want to know that. I'd also be curious about this inscription, to Jonathan Williams Esquire, from B. Franklin. Okay, so who is Jonathan Williams Esquire, and why is Ben Franklin sending him a copy of the Constitution? I'd be curious about why and how it was printed. So to answer the first question, we need to know something a little bit about who Ben Franklin was and who he was related to. So who is this Jonathan Williams character, and how does he get Ben Franklin's, personal copy of the Constitution? Well, I think one thing to start with is very back far in Franklin's beginnings, which is the fact that Franklin grew up very poor. And he talks a little bit about this in his autobiography, but I don't even think he does it justice. So he has a literal rags from riches type of tale. Ben Franklin was born the youngest son of the youngest son. He was born to Josiah Franklin Sr., who with 2 wives had 17 children. And he was the 8th child of Josiah and his second wife, Abiah Folger Franklin. Now, Franklin grew up in the house of a tradesman. Now, Josiah was actually a very skilled silk dyer. He had apprenticed in London. He actually was English. He migrated over to the colonies from England for religious reasons. He was a very devout Puritan. And, when he got to Boston, because he comes for religion, there's not much of a call to be a silk dyer in colonial Boston. So he changes his profession to something adjacent, which is to be a chandler. He's a soap and candle maker. Still things that you make, having some knowledge of chemistry. So every one of Franklin's sons, they go out and they get their own trade. They're apprenticed. And Ben Franklin, as we know, decides he's going to become a printer. Josiah's daughters, whether they're from the first marriage or the second marriage, they're all married off to husbands, usually of the same tradesperson ilk. So how do we get to Jonathan Williams? Well, Josiah Franklin's first wife and child, she bears him 7 children, and 3 of those children were born in England. But their 5th child was born in Boston, and that's Anne. Anne marries a man named Isaac Harris, and they produce several children, one of whom is Grace Harris. So Grace Harris is Ben Franklin's niece, only he's closer in age to Grace than he actually is to his sister Anne. So Grace and Franklin kind of grow up together. Grace is especially close with Ben's youngest sister, Jane Franklin, and she eventually gets married to a merchant named Jonathan Williams Sr. And together they have a couple children, and one of them is Jonathan Williams Jr. So Jonathan Williams is actually Ben Franklin's grandnephew. If we could just go to the next slide. Ben kind of charts this out for us a little bit. There's a wonderful document of the genealogical chart of the Franklin tree that Ben Franklin helped to create. He actually went to Ecton while he was in London serving as a colonial agent. And Ecton is where his family was from. And so he went through the graveyard and the baptismal and the death books and figured out who he was related to and mapped it out on a family tree. And so he put himself down on his family tree. And this is his sister, Anne. So you can just see how far apart in age they really are. In fact, Anne was born in the 17th century. Ben was born in the early 18th century. If we go to the next slide. The reason that I bring up that Ben grew up poor is because he ends up, as he's making his wealth as a printer, he is reliant on Grace Harris's husband, Jonathan Williams, to help take care of his poorer relations, especially Jane. He didn't quite trust, it seems, his family with money, so he doesn't send them money directly. So he sends it through Jonathan Williams and makes sure that Jonathan make sure that they have a roof over their head, food on the table to eat. So he befriends the Williamses much that way, as they become just a source of helping to take care of his family and making sure that his money is going to where they need to be. Now, his grandnephew, Jonathan Jr., he grows up, and because he's, the son of a merchant, he actually goes off to Harvard, which was something that Franklin couldn't ever do. He goes off to Harvard and he trains as a merchant and an accountant. In fact, at one point, after he trains in a bank at Boston, he goes to England, where he's a sugar factory. He's buying sugar from the Caribbean in London and selling it at different prices. And he's kind of like the middleman in that sugar trade. And this actually worked out really nice when his great uncle ends up becoming the first minister plenipotentiary of France, the first diplomat or consul, and then the minister plenipotentiary in France. So Williams goes over when he's 24 or 25 years old in late 1776 to visit his great uncle. So he goes across the channel to France. And it's while he's in France that Silas Deane, who is from Connecticut, he was a Continental Congressman. He ends up being the secret envoy from the Continental Congress to France. And his whole job is to basically buy supplies for the Continental Army. And Silas Deane's downfall was he was never really a great accountant, couldn't keep the books. And so when he sees young Williams come up and visit his uncle, he suggests that Williams become the U.S. purchasing agent for goods in the big port city of Nantes, France. And so Williams ends up working with his great uncle a lot because Franklin is essentially the U.S. ambassador to France, and Williams is playing a big role in helping the U.S. purchase and gather supplies that it can use in its own war effort. The fact that Franklin took Williams in and, didn't say no when Silas Deane suggested that Williams serve in this role shows you also that Ben Franklin took care of family members who he thought were hardworking. He tried to take care of several of Jane's children, his own grandchildren, and some of them worked really hard and he was happy to help. And some of them took his help, but didn't work really hard. Williams does fall in that camp where he worked really hard, made something of himself. And Williams was, very happy, or Franklin was very happy to take care of Williams in that regard. If we could go to the next slide. So this is Jonathan Williams Jr. Unfortunately, the only painting we have of him is late in his life. So while he's in France, he ends up studying military science. And when he returns to the United States after the war, he moves from Boston to Philadelphia. He replaces his father, Jonathan Williams Sr., as Franklin's person who helps take care of Jane and his other poorer relatives. And he ends up, joining an artillery regiment, and then he's one of the first commandants of West Point Military Academy. During his later years in 1815, which is when this painting was painted, he is elected to Congress from Pennsylvania, where he dies very early into his first term as a congressman. But this is a painting we have, and this is who we're talking about, Jonathan Williams Jr. So to answer that first question, he is Ben Franklin's grandnephew, and he ends up being very close to Franklin because of the time they spent in France working the United States' cause to win the war for independence from the French side. If we go to the next slide. So how does Franklin's copy of the Constitution go to Williams? Well, we know they're close, so that's likely why Ben Franklin sent it to him. We also know that they are spending a lot of time talking about politics. They're working for the cause of the revolution in France together. But how does Franklin get this copy of the Constitution? If we could go to the next slide. So the thing about Franklin is he serves in France for a good time. So the war technically ends in 1783 when they sign and ratify the Treaty of Paris. Early 1784, I think, is when it ends up being formally ratified. But he doesn't return to Philadelphia until September 13, 1785. At that time, Franklin is 79 years old. And upon his return, his fellow Pennsylvanians elect him to be president of the state of Pennsylvania, which is the equivalent of what we would call a governor now, but they called it the president of the state of Pennsylvania. And he actually gets to be in the top office, making sure that the Constitution of Pennsylvania is applied throughout the state. And That must have been something for Franklin because he helped draft that state constitution. In Pennsylvania, you could only be president 3 times for 3 terms, and Pennsylvanians elected him for that maximum amount of time. So Franklin, when he returns home, he doesn't really get much of a vacation. He's elected to state office, and he spends a lot of time working for the state government of Pennsylvania. 2 years into his term as the president of Pennsylvania, they call the Constitutional Convention, which convenes in his home city of Philadelphia, with the express goal of amending the Articles of Confederation so that this new national government could function properly. Of course, we know what they really do in the Constitutional Convention, which is they just scrap the Articles of Confederation and draft an entirely new constitution. Calling this Constitutional Convention was a bit, I don't want to say controversial, but it wasn't exactly true to form. It was kind of a contentious thing for Americans that this Constitutional Convention was called. So people like George Washington debated about whether to go. I haven't really found much in the way of Franklin debating about whether he should go to the Constitutional Convention. It was in his hometown, so he didn't really have to travel far. And by the time he's 81 years old, he almost doesn't care what people think of him anymore. He just knows that he has worked hard throughout his life. He, as Sarah said, has fashioned himself in these different depictions of artwork and as a fixture in diplomatic circles and scientific circles. So he's achieved the reputation that he hopes to achieve. And it is that reputation that actually causes Franklin to need to go to the Constitutional Convention. People who are in favor of the Constitutional Convention are asking Franklin to attend, just like they asked George Washington to attend. If we could go to the next slide. Franklin and George Washington are needed at this Constitutional Convention to lend the convention legitimacy. If it produces the new government, which it does, people will have faith that this was something that these 2 big leaders, these 2 most famous Americans, and they really are the most famous Americans there are in 1787. If they're at this convention, then the government must be something that is worth considering. So Franklin decides he's going to go to the convention. It's rumored that he'll even be elected president of the convention. But then George Washington at the last minute decides he's going to show up. And so Franklin's fine with it. George Washington becomes the president of the Constitutional Convention. And just like Franklin, he doesn't really necessarily do much. He provides, Washington presides over the Constitutional Convention, but he doesn't say much. And Franklin didn't either. Instead, he goes to the Constitutional Convention 5 hours a day, 4 days a week, and he sits back and he lets others talk. Franklin's one big contribution to the convention is that he closes it. After months of deliberation where they crafted this new constitution and the convention asks that the states consider it and ratify it, Franklin gets up and he gives a little speech, and he remarks that the success of any government really rests on the general opinion of the goodness of that government, as well as of the wisdom and integrity of its governors. So this is kind of the role that Franklin and Washington have gone to the Constitutional Convention to fill. They're both considered wise individuals, individuals with a lot of integrity, and hopefully, because they were overseeing this, they have produced a good government. Next slide, please. So the other famous thing to come out of the Constitutional Convention is this phrase, a republic if you can keep it, which we see repeated in documents and stories of the Constitutional Convention a lot. It has been a bit muddled. A historian named Zara Ennis Hanslin at the University of Delaware has done some work to suss out what really happened and where this comment came from. And she found that it was Elizabeth Willing Powell who elicited this comment from Franklin. So after the Constitutional Convention is closed, Franklin has given his speech. He walks out the door, and Elizabeth Willing Powell is there, and she confronts Franklin and the other delegates, but she confronts Franklin and she says, so what kind of government did this convention produce? Did it produce a monarchy, or do we have a republic? And then Franklin replied, you have a republic if you can keep it, madam. So she, that gets people a lot of thinking. And I think it's really a poignant way to kind of end our little talk on Franklin. because he was getting to the point of saying what a lot of us are thinking now. We all know that our democracy is in jeopardy. So what can we do to keep our democracy and our republic flourishing and upright and make sure that people are getting the right to vote? Well, we need to answer the question, how can we keep it? And we know we have to be able to keep it because republics and democracies are something that you have to work for.
All right. And thank you, Liz. So, Allison, I see that you have quite a lot of questions for us tonight.
There are indeed quite a lot of questions. And I want to thank the people who also used our online form to submit questions in advance. We really appreciate you taking the time to do that. So we're going to start with a few from that. And if I pronounce anyone's name incorrectly, I do apologize. So I'll just give that disclaimer ahead of time. But the first question that we have here comes from Kamaya, and Kamaya is a student from New Jersey and wants to know, what was Franklin's relationship with his family, his wife and his sons?
Yeah.
Franklin has a very interesting relationship with his families, and I should use the plural there. So he has the family that he's married to and the family that, like, his own children. So this family consists of Deborah Reed Franklin, who is his common law wife. So they're not formally married in the eyes of the government or in the eyes of the church. They are married legally in the eyes of the government because they just start cohabitating with each other. They cohabitate and they promise themselves to each other, but they couldn't get married because while Ben Franklin was in London the first time, he never writes to Deborah. Like, they have promised themselves to each other, they're betrothed, and he never writes her. So Deborah Reed's mother convinces her to marry someone else. And it turns out that this guy was already married, so guilty of bigamy. And then he goes out to sea after he squanders her dowry, which is the money that a family would pay for a man to take their daughter off their hands for them, essentially. And so he squanders her dowry. He goes to the Caribbean and he's presumed dead. So they can't really legally get married because if Franklin marries her, then he's married like a known bigamist, and that's not going to work. Further, it comes out that not long after they agree to live together and be common law spouses, Franklin finds this child. He just comes in with Deborah. He's holding this baby boy, which he names William, his son William, and he says, "This is my legitimate son, and we're just going to raise him." So you can imagine what Deborah Reed felt about that. But she does raise Billy, and Franklin and Billy are pretty inseparable. So when you look at William Franklin and Ben Franklin's relationship, until the Revolution, they're like best of friends. It's really solid. But as soon as William Franklin says, "No, I'm going to support the crown," and he becomes a loyalist, he and Ben Franklin just cuts all ties with William Franklin. He takes care of William's own illegitimate son, William Temple Franklin. And he just never really talks to William ever again. It's actually really sad. Franklin has his own son with Deborah Reed. His name is Frankie. And Frankie was three or four when he died. He died of smallpox, and it was a great hit upon Franklin. He says he never recovered from the death of Francis Franklin because the child had been sickly. And so Franklin and Deborah didn't have him inoculated from smallpox. And inoculation for smallpox is something that Ben Franklin really advocated in his newspapers. And then, of course, his son Frankie dies of smallpox. So not only does he face the death, but he has this bit of controversy. And then years later, he and Deborah have their last child together, Sarah. Her name is Sarah Franklin, and they call her Sally, and she eventually marries this guy, Richard Bache. So Franklin, at the time that Sally is old enough to really have a relationship with him, he's really off in England. Deborah Reed refuses to travel the ocean. She came over as a child from England with her parents, so she may have had a traumatic experience there, but she refuses to travel to Europe with Franklin. She won't get on the ship. And so Sarah stays with Deborah Reed, and they have a long distance relationship. So Franklin's like the kindly father who gives her advice and buys her things, but he doesn't really have like a formal relationship with her until he's retiring. But he does form these other families in these countries that he goes to. So he lives with the Stevensons, this widow named Margaret Stevenson and her wife, her daughter, Polly. Franklin is doing all the things with Polly that he should have probably been doing with Sally, answering questions, teaching her things. He's very close, much closer with Margaret and her daughter than he is with his own family. So he has a kind of interesting track record and relationships when it comes to his family.
Allison, before we move to the next one, it's a very interesting thing when people tell you that history is boring and that people in the past were so prim and proper, because once you deep dive into history, it's just as interesting and messy as it is today. And I think this was a fascinating little chat you just gave there. So Allison, do you have another question?
I do, and there are two questions that are about Ben Franklin's fashion. So I'll ask one, and then just know that a part 2 is coming right after that regarding the fashion. But this first question comes from Charlotte, and Charlotte is a student right here in New York. And Charlotte talks about how Franklin's fashion promotes the American zeitgeist. Homespun, self-reliant, revolutionist, frontiersman, a tactic that won him the support of the French. His strategy really relied on artists painting his portrait, and Charlotte says that they were the social media of their time. But Charlotte's question is sort of a three-parter, such that, do you think the artists were aware that they were promoting Franklin's political agenda? What were the artists' motivation in all of this? And were they just looking to paint whoever commissioned them, or were they compelled to paint Franklin because he may be aligned with their own political views? Really great questions.
Absolutely, Charlotte. That's an amazing question. So first of all, I think that, even today, when we think of fashion, we think of France. And I think the fact that Franklin comes in and he's not wearing a wig and he's wearing his quote unquote Quaker attire. And he does this intentionally to, one, probably reflect what he did wear, and two, appeal to this fascination with America. And remember that many people in France who were looking at this art were wealthy, they were elite. And so it may have been more the novelty of the image as opposed to understanding what politically that would mean for them in France circa 1789. So certainly we know that French fashion is highly influenced by what Franklin wore. And we see during the times of the National Convention and the rise of Robespierre in France that French fashion takes a very austere turn. So I think there's kind of a give and take, but remember that these artists are very much aware that Franklin is a philosopher and he should be depicted alongside the ranks of Rousseau and Voltaire. And so in many ways, they're, contributing and taking money from the aristocracy, but they are also, in a way, supporting an ideology that would cause the institution to crumble, at least for a solid 10 years in France. It'll be brought back eventually. But thank you so much for your question, Charlotte. I really appreciate it.
Liz, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that was spot on. And I think Zara's point where Franklin very much knows the image she wants to convey. If we want to bring it to contemporary places, everybody's talking about the gentleman who founded not Bitcoin, but the big Bitcoin base, about how he curated this image of kind of aloof and sleeping in his office. Franklin was doing that well before this guy. So, he knew what he was doing, and he was always trying to affect whatever ends he had in mind, but be they political, personal, or whatever.
Okay, Allison?
Yeah, so the next question regarding Franklin's fashion comes from Alyssa. And Alyssa is a student in California and is focused more on Franklin's fur hat that he wore. Alyssa says, why do you think Ben Franklin's fur cap garnered the most attention in France rather than his more unusual sartorial choices? It altered the French perception of America, but did it also shape fashion in America, or was it just a facade?
So that's an amazing question, Alyssa. And again, thank you so much. I'm so glad to see my Student Advisory Council members here at ITV tonight. So I think when we think about global commodities, fur was becoming a global commodity at the time. And let's be really clear, a lot of the times Franklin was actually wearing fur that was quite rare, fur from Russia, fur even from Japan, not necessarily from America, but there was this Americana associated with the fur cap. And I don't know if you've ever seen the HBO series John Adams, and I don't want to get into a debate about Adams, but there is an amazing scene where the actor who wonderfully plays Franklin takes his beaver hat off and starts collecting money from the French aristocracy. So I think, again, it's that idea of America. And certainly we associate fur with, the French colonies here. And so coming from the entire, what we call the Louisiana Purchase, there would have been more and more fur coming into France. But again, it's intentional and it's a part of Franklin's persona.
Okay. Allison?
Thank you. Yeah. So the next question comes from Leonard. And Leonard wants to know, or Leonard asks, do you know what Franklin's relationship was with George Washington by the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787?
That's a really good question, Leonard. I don't imagine he had much of a relationship with Washington, because if you think about their time together, they serve in the early days of the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress. And pretty quickly after that Congress meets, Washington is appointed to be commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And so by mid-June, Washington is on his way to Cambridge, and he and Franklin won't really cross paths because Washington will be on the battlefield and Franklin will be sent to places like Canada on a congressional mission to figure out what's going on with the war in Canada. And then he'll be sent, of course, to France, where he spends the remainder of the war. So I'm sure I know Franklin and Washington knew of each other, but they wouldn't have had much of a relationship. What they did have was a lot of experience in common. So Washington was on the battlefield, Franklin was on the diplomatic circuit, and both would have experienced just the, poor government of the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation Congress. You have to remember that people are fighting this revolution in part because they view the government of Great Britain as corrupt, as having too much centralized power and not enough local rule. So when they have to go and create their own government, they don't want a strong central government. They come up with the Articles of Confederation, which doesn't really even give the centralized government much power to do much of anything. And that's not even ratified until 1781. So they spend most of the war under the government of a Second Continental Congress. And these congressmen just keep kind of bickering back and forth. There's a lot of regional ties and regional squabbles. They're bickering over who's commanding the military. They just have a lot on their plate. And so every time you're George Washington and you have to write a letter to Congress and beg for supplies for your troops, or you're Franklin and you're like, I really need to have this information and these official credentials to work with the French government. And then you just meet with months and months of silence and an inability of Congress to do anything about it. And so this is why I think both men show up at the Constitutional Convention, is because they have really firsthand knowledge that the government under the Articles of Confederation, a government that has too much power in the states and not enough at top with a single entity negotiating and governing things, that's a big problem. And they both experience that problem.
Another one, Allison?
Yeah. So this question that comes next is from LaRaven, and LaRaven asks, Why did Elizabeth question Benjamin Franklin?
That's a really good question, LaRaven. I don't know specifically why she went to the Constitutional Convention and questioned, but, William Powell lived in Philadelphia. Everybody knew that the convention was meeting. It was supposed to be met in secret. We know that James Madison kept all these notes later because they become published. And that tells us a lot of what happened in the Constitutional Convention. But most of these convention delegates aren't really talking about it outside of Congress. So there's a great curiosity going on. We know from the work of Mary Sarah Bilder at Boston College Law School, she just came out with a wonderful book called Female Genius, that there are a lot of women in Philadelphia and elsewhere very curious about what's happening at the Constitutional Convention. Bilder contends that we lived in this moment in 1787 where it was understood that women would get to participate politically. It was just a matter of how they would participate politically. And so she writes a really convincing argument in this book, Female Genius. And so you have educated women like Elizabeth Willing Powell, like Abigail Adams in Massachusetts and other places, really thinking about what their place in the government will be, what kind of constitution are they going to come up with, and also like how much power might women and other people have in the Constitution. So my guess is that she posed this question to Franklin because she was genuinely curious about what kind of government that they had created and whether they were going to see the things that they had suffered through and fought for through the revolution come into reality.
Allison, I think we have time for one more question.
One more question. Oh, there's so many more that are really fantastic. I wish we could get to all of them, but I will ask this last one as kind of like a summation of the program. This question comes from D. Michael, who asks, how do you think the humble beginnings of Franklin and his self-made rise as notoriety helped inspire those during the birth of our new nation?
Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Sarah, from a art and material culture standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's very inspirational. And part of the big picture analysis that I would always challenge my students to think about is that we're really seeing an economic shift going on in Western culture. And we're seeing the rise of the bourgeoisie in France, the middle class. We're seeing the rise of this new era of citizen in America. And again, I go back to this idea of classicism, of Greece and Rome. I mean, why do we look back at Solon and say Solon's reforms were amazing? Because he wanted government officials to be paid so that the common man could actually participate in civic practices for the first time, and that it wasn't just going to be restricted to the aristocracy, and that ripple of participation, of engagement, of democracy is going to further expand as our nation evolves. And I think that while many of the framers were extremely wealthy, Franklin's story, and actually, if I can put a plug in for History Now, because there are some amazing articles about rethinking the economic identity of some of the framers that were published recently by our institute. We really need to think about this broader rise of the common man and how it inspires all the Atlantic revolutions.
Yeah, and I think I would just add that Franklin is inspirational. It's part of the reason that they send him to France. He's impressive. He did grow up pretty poor and he made a lot of money. I mean, this is an individual who retired at the age of 42. So he could devote himself to his scientific experiments and his political ambitions. And I think with Franklin, because he was such a great writer, because he had such a sense of humor, because he was a very accomplished scientist and thinker and philanthropist. I mean, he set up a lot of Philadelphia's philanthropic institutions. He helped set up the University of Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia Hospital. He helped set up the first library, the Library Company of Philadelphia. He establishes the American Philosophical Society. He is a promise of what America and Americans could be, especially culturally. And that, after the revolution and they get their independence from Great Britain, they spend a lot of time, Americans, trying to figure out who it is they are and what makes them different from Britons. And I think with Franklin, they get a window as to what they could be as Americans, and it offers something to them that's very inspirational and very promising.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you both for that. And as we're wrapping up for the evening, Liz, can you tell us a little bit about your work, both with the podcast and with Colonial Williamsburg?
Sure. So Ben Franklin's World is a podcast about early American history. It's about the world he lived in, not always about Ben Franklin. But what it is aimed to do is to help you, if you have an interest in history, learn more about it. So I'll connect you with historians, and we break down these complex ideas into an intelligible conversation, an accessible conversation, and fun stories. So it is geared towards adults more than students, but I've heard a lot of teachers use it with their high school students, and they use it for information that educates themselves so that they can bring more information into their classroom. So we release every other Tuesday, knock on wood. We've never missed a release date in almost 9 years. So we've been publishing for a while, and you can find us on benfranklinsworld.com, where we started now offering transcripts of our episodes, or you can find us on your favorite podcast player. And then as of early this month, I started with the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. I'm their new founding director of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. And part of my team is the Colonial Williamsburg Teacher Institute. So they offer week-long and residential programs. They offer 3-day programs, and they offer a lot of online programs, just like this one that Gilder Lehrman does. So they complement each other really nicely. So if you'd like to learn more about their offerings, please visit colonialwilliamsburg.org/teach. And when you get the slides, they're hyperlinks, so you can click on both.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was absolutely fascinating. And you've really helped, humanize Franklin and let us see him beyond sort of the two-dimensional character that I think sometimes get created by popular culture.
And I know there's a lot of questions. If you email Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, I'm always happy to reach out and have a conversation. So please don't let your questions go unanswered.
And for Gilder Lehrman's upcoming programs, Sarah, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you want to talk about our teacher seminars too?
Yeah, I mean, I found my way to Gilder Lehrman through the teacher seminars, and I really recommend that teachers apply. We have a symposium. We also have some on-site seminars. They are fabulous. I mean, imagine being able to connect with truly passionate history teachers from all around the country, as well as experts in the field. When I almost 20 years ago attended my first teacher seminar, it was transformational. And in fact, that's really what piqued my interest about the visual culture of Washington. And in many ways, the lessons that I taught with students were incredibly informed by what I learned from Gilder Lehrman. And here I am now trying to give back to the Institute. So I really encourage any teachers out there to apply. And if there are students watching, tell your teachers about the Institute, because it's an amazing opportunity.
Yep. Allison, do you want to fill us in on the rest of the programs?
Sure. So you may notice that Inside the Vault is missing from this slide, but we are not ending the program. Don't worry. We'll be back next month, the first Thursday in March. So look out for information from us on our website about the topic and how you can sign up. But before that, Book Breaks is taking place this Sunday, February 5th at 2 p.m., where our Isabella Morales will join us to discuss Happy Dreams of Liberty, an American Family in Slavery and Freedom. Sarah mentioned the Teacher Symposium. Madison is sharing links for all of these things in the chat. So click there for information right now. but everything will also be in the email going out tomorrow. Last but not least, if you have not looked into Gettysburg College, Gilder, Lehrman, MA in American History, you absolutely want to do that. We've included here the courses that are being offered this summer. Applications to the program are on a rolling basis. So if you're interested in being a part of the program this summer, you can apply right now. And once you're accepted, you can begin once the enrollment for each period opens up. So really phenomenal classes taught by really, really exceptional historians. Just absolutely amazing. So once again, Madison is putting those links in the chat for you. We've had some questions from the Q&A this evening about the recording. The recording will be in your email inbox by tomorrow afternoon if you're on the East Coast. So I send it out around noon Eastern time every Friday after the program. So if it is later than that in the day and you haven't received it, please email us at collectionprograms@gilderlehrman.org. There is a strong possibility that if you haven't received it, it just means that your email server is blocking our email to you. So try a different email address and let us know you've not gotten all your stuff, and we'll be happy to send this, the slide deck, all the program links, and much more right to you right away.
Yep. And our next ITV is on Margaret Corbin. She served during the American Revolution, and she is the first recognized female veteran in the United States. And we have some documents discussing whether she's considered a woman or whether she's considered a veteran and whether she should be entitled to her pension. So spoiler alert, she gets the pension, but it's an interesting story. And we are going to end with a new product that we have. I am very excited about this. We just published a new traveling exhibition, Frederick Douglass, Advocate for Equality. It's 6 panels examining Douglass's entire life, from his life under slavery, his education, freedom, all the way through the fight against Jim Crow. It's an amazing story. It's told through Douglass's words. And so we see him constantly relying on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to make his arguments. And he keeps coming back to education and voting rights as very important for achieving equality in the US. So we're really excited about this. I am particularly proud of it because it's been my project for the last 4 months. So we're excited. And with that, I am going to say thank you so much to both Liz and Zara. It's been wonderful talking with you tonight and learning from you. We've had a lot of questions, and so I know everybody's really thankful for what you've been able to share tonight. And I'm going to say thank you to everybody for joining us. Have a good night. Bye.
All right.